Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our regional conferences for London, the South East and the Eastern regions. You've got a fantastic lineup with Stella Creasy giving you her keynote speech and then moving into your workshop sessions discussing two critical issues for society and our country moving forward: social care and our high streets, very fundamental to our purpose as a society, but also our place as people and the connection that we feel to our local communities too. Last year has been difficult, and we need to reflect not just on that has tried us, and it's been very difficult, whether it's been about your employment situation, whether it's trying to reconcile home working and family life and children not being in school, whether it's about missing out on loved ones and the connection that we have as people, or even just actually that social connection that we all feel where we're not meeting people in the way that we used to. It's all taken its toll, and that's before you get anywhere near the health implications in terms of people being unwell and unfortunately people passing away through COVID as well. What we've also seen is the very best of our country. We have seen our frontline workers step up and support us in our greatest need. We have seen our neighbours rally together and give us the love and the compassion and the support that has helped us get through a very difficult time. And we have seen, of course, the very value of public services throughout that too. And I'm delighted the role that the cooperative movement has played, whether it's about our frontline workers in food retail that have made sure not just that there are food on the shelves, but of course that there's food on our table, often putting themselves in a situation where they're at risk themselves by enforcing the laws that we set in Parliament. What we need to do for 2021 is not just think about how we get through the next few months, although that's been almost a hallmark of 2020, but also what type of country we want when we come out the other side. And quite a number of the policy debates that we'll be talking about today are about that. We can't go back to business as usual. We can't go back to the way things were because it wasn't very good to begin with. You know, the reason why we have struggled through the pandemic is because the foundations of our society have been eroded after a decade of austerity. And so we can't go back to that. But even before austerity, for many people, they were denied the power and the opportunities that they deserve in one of the world's richest country. And that can't carry on. That cannot be the status quo anymore. Now, when we talk about a new settlement and we talk about what the new world might be, I believe strongly that the answers lie in the cooperative movement, where through our collective endeavour, when we pull together, when we work together for a common endeavour, that we all then get to share the benefits and the dividend that comes with that. It can't be anymore that people work hard, work multiple jobs, work long hours, sacrifice their home life and the rest, but then can barely put food on the table and cover the rent. That can't be the new settlement going forward. And hopefully we'll see through the course of this year, the ideas will come from our movement, the solutions will come from our movement, and they'll be rooted in community and our lived experience. And for me, that's really been the hallmark of cooperation through the pandemic. It's not just ideas, it's not just about policy, it's about doing, it's about rolling our sleeves up and demonstrating that through cooperation, we can really come through this on the other side, but come out in a better state than we went into the pandemic in. Now, I'm delighted that we've got two new members of staff supporting the conference today, Chantal and Matt Partridge, and they'll be speaking a bit later. And Matt, I believe that congratulations are in order for the arrival of a New Year's baby in Ava. So congratulations to you and your family. And I'm sure I'm not sure I can see bags under your eyes, but if you're not doing the early morning feed just now at a conference, it's a fantastic experience. And almost in the most difficult and challenging times, we look to these moments of joy to get us through that. So congratulations to you. And Chantal, welcome to the team too. I'm sure you'll experience a fantastic team of cooperators, people who are in politics to make a difference, and not just around the edges. You know, if you are in politics, you're in politics because you want to change the world. And I believe through the cooperative part in our movement, we can do that. Now, without further ado, I want to hand over to a name that you will recognise and one of our stars of the movement, and a member now of the NEC of the Cooperative Party too, and a good friend of ours in Parliament. Stella Creasy, over to you.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for that kind welcome. We have a very exciting lineup of speakers today at our regional conference, and I'm delighted because there has never been a more important time for us to come together and ask how we can shape the future of our nation, because our future seems so uncertain. It is sobering to realise that our economy in the UK has suffered the biggest contraction of all of the G7 and the highest excess all-cause mortality rate of 23 European countries. So I want to start today by recognising and thanking everyone on this webinar for their work they've done over the past year to keep our cities, our communities and our country together. The Rochdale pioneers recognised that in times of uncertainty and change, we are each other's best hope. The principles they set up are more relevant than ever. Self-help, responsibility, democracy, equity, equality and solidarity. Simply, they use their collective might to take charge of the means of production and make markets work for them on their own terms. Well, this year, the co-op movement has used its collective might and shown that even in the face of a pandemic, our best chance of survival is through collaboration, not competition. Throughout this nation, people have engaged in a year of cooperative activism, whether they've realised or not. Volunteers have worked alongside NHS staff at Nightingale hospitals. Volunteer ambulance crews are supporting the 999 call-outs. Thousands have been delivering medicines from pharmacies, driving patients to and from hospital, or making phone calls to check on those people who are isolating at this time. 8 million people in the UK were struggling to put food on the table before lockdown. Food insecurity has quadrupled since, but it's been volunteer-led food banks that have been a lifeline for many. Those mutual aid groups have held so many communities together through the dark days of isolation and shielding. How many of us are all now in a WhatsApp group with our neighbours? And our co-op movement has led the way in its food justice campaign. And that is just the first challenge that we need to answer as we come together. Because over the last year, thousands of people have acted as cooperators, but they wouldn't recognise themselves as such. People who look to this government and the choices that it makes and just despair. Yes, sadly today, Gavin Williamson is still our Education Secretary. Dominic Cummings is still officially on gardening leave. Millions haven't had any financial support at all. Hundreds of thousands have lost their jobs in hospitality or retail with little alternative in sight. We face a tsunami of mum unemployment as the government spends more time worried about fox hunting than the childcare sector. People who need a political voice to match their activism. We, as the co-op movement, have won that battle of ideas with this country, but as yet not the battle of identity. And the second challenge is the one that Jim has set us, that we face the pressure to get back to normal as soon as possible. With that vaccine offering all of us the precious hope that has been so absent, it's tempting to agree. But the underlying inequalities and injustices in our country that drove us all into politics have been magnified by coronavirus, and they cannot be ignored. Before the pandemic, over half of adults on the lowest incomes in this country were relying on borrowing to pay for their everyday living costs. When the pandemic hit, age-adjusted death rates in the most deprived rates were more than double those in the least deprived areas. And Baroness Doreen Lawrence's review for the Labour Party on the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 should shame us all. It found that Black, Asian and ethnic minority people have been overexposed, underprotected, stigmatised and overlooked. And that was the consequence of decades of structural injustice, inequality and discrimination. So to go back to normal is to risk accepting that inequality and injustice as inevitable and ask those who've been hardest hit by this pandemic to continue to pay the price. We know that is not the co-op way. So we know we have to use this opportunity to show people that collective activism is what got us through this pandemic, and it is what will get us through to a better future for all too. That we have the answers for what that alternative approach to running our country can be. If we want to tackle the cost of living, we in the South East know that we have to tackle the cost of a roof over your head. With a third of all Londoners renting privately, this is one of the most expensive rental markets in the world, with average rents exceeding 50% of average salaries in all boroughs bar one. But it's the co-op movement that has been challenging that, with over 300 housing co-ops in London alone and community land trusts now beginning to offer a real alternative for millions of families cut out of our housing market. And if we want to bring back the jobs to help the millions who have lost them, we need to protect those who already have them and build for the chance for many more to create their own. You know, almost 500,000 Londoners work in retail, yet we know too many face violence, threats, and abuse while at work. Let us celebrate the victory of Daniel Johnson, our brother in the co-op movement in Scotland, in securing legislation to protect shop workers, and commit ourselves to replicating that in the rest of the UK. But we know, as Jim has said, that working from home has fundamentally changed the future of retail. So we should also look to the co-op movement for models of job creation, the communities where they've taken over much-loved pubs or assets to create social enterprises when traditional profiteering companies have long gone. Co-ops are less likely to fail. 80% of cooperative businesses survive those notoriously challenging first 5 years, compared to just 44% of other businesses. And we know that co-ops help anchor the rest of the economy too. Economies with large numbers of cooperative sectors are more equitable, they're more productive, and they're more accountable, with a narrowing between that gap between the rich and the poor. The co-op effect spreads wide and far. But we know right now that the cooperative economy is just 2% of the UK's GDP. In Finland, it's 21%, Sweden 13%, Italy 10%. That's why I think we should support Seema Malhotra's call for a London Cooperative Commission to look at how we can fast track their growth here in our city. Indeed, when Scotland did that with the cooperative development movement, it's made a massive impact. In the last 5 years, the number of employee and worker-owned businesses there has trebled. And we know the damage that Brexit will do to our economy and to our trading opportunities. That as a nation, we have walked away from our biggest cooperative endeavour in an attempt to be a sole trader. That's why we as the co-op movement should champion the links between cooperatives around the continent to ensure that none of those doors to collaboration are closed to UK cooperatives. We see this attempt to isolate the UK, the predatory behaviour of landlords, of some businesses, the ones who are hiring staff they've just fired, like BA and British Gas, the predatory lenders, like the buy now, pay later companies who are the new payday loan scandal waiting to happen. And we have to show there is a different way, that co-op way, and that isn't just about the private sector. The truth is, as much as we are all in awe of what the NHS has been doing in this crisis, there is an accountability gap. With more and more people living with long-term health conditions, patient involvement is absolutely crucial to their life chances and the outcomes of our NHS. So we must speak up for that process, not just to improve services, but to improve lives. That is also true with social care, a sector we have sadly seen this last year show how being undervalued and stripped of resources costs lives. Care co-ops would give back the dignity and say over their futures to those people long overdue. It's also the answer to the challenges with our nurseries, who are currently struggling as the government is unwilling to fund places and so is forcing to stay open, taking risks with infection rates as a result. Parents and staff put in an impossible position as profit and government ideology gets prioritised as head of safety. Our values infuse the way we do business and the business that we do. That we see the levels of loneliness and poor mental health in our communities not as a private concern, but a matter for public action which we can take. The pandemic has kept us all physically apart, with recent research showing that loneliness is greatest amongst our young people. The co-op way is about how we can get the best out of all of our assets to tackle these problems. And for many of us, our parks and our green spaces have been a vital place during these past months. In a city where some families have the benefit of private garden squares to self-isolate, while others have been in overcrowded flats fighting to use laptops, we should value our green spaces even more. And when we can be together again in person, we should celebrate them. We should be the party working to promote the street parties, the mailers, the festivals that build community spirit, the football clubs with the co-op leading the way on fan ownership to save our beautiful game, learning from the examples of Dulwich Hamlets and Wimbledon. That social time matters because we know the threats to our communities, the threats to our values are not just about the cost of living or the quality of public services. It's also about those people who would divide us, the people who want to pit Remain versus Leave, black versus white, rich versus poor. We are seeing far-right populism on the rise across the world. But it took the storming of the Capitol before this government finally recognised Trump for the danger that he was. It's too late. And it's too late if you say you'll be at Cable Street, but don't recognise it matters to act before, to build community cohesion before that's even a possibility. And that means being prepared to stand up to fight for our values, because we know there are others ready to fill the breach. As Donald Trump tweeted in August 2016, one of the key problems today is that politics is such a disgrace. Good people don't go into government. Well, sadly, he took his own advice. As a political movement, we have to offer both a political and a community response. London has a proud history of welcoming those escaping violence or persecution from across the world. We should be proud of the community sponsorship groups and the voluntary organisations who supported refugees to settle in our country, over 1,000 of them in London alone. And that takes me to our third and final challenge. I am delighted that Matt and Chantal have been appointed, because we can't advocate for those values if we don't live them ourselves. We know we have a job of work to do to open up our movement to all the talent and the diversity of our country. And we cannot do that if we're not honest with ourselves that we still don't quite look like the communities we wish to serve. We can start by acting to tell the hidden stories of our pioneers. So today I want to make sure you've heard the name of Margaret Llewellyn Davies, a key figure in the Women's Cooperative Guild of the early 20th century. She was ahead of her time. She campaigned for radical liberalisation of the divorce laws and maternity rights. She openly talked about uncomfortable issues like domestic violence, rarely discussed at the time and still relevant, sadly, today. In 2021, let's celebrate and uncover more of our community pioneers, past and present, to inspire more people to be part of our movement. There is so much to do. We have to reclaim collective activism that's been the hallmark of this country in the last year and show that we are the ones who have the answers about how to rebuild our country ravaged by the pandemic and Brexit, and that we are willing to change to meet the needs of the times too ourselves. Now, as a co-op movement, we cannot do this top down. It's for each of us to be part of renewing from the grassroots up the cooperative movements and activism that will help transform this country as it recovers from the pandemic. And with that, I want to leave you with the words of that famous cooperator, Socrates. Socrates said, "The secret of change is to focus all of your energy, not on fighting the old, but on building the new." We've got a job of work to do with those people who want a better society, to show them that we are their voice. But there is so much power and potential in the cooperative movement. We have a massive opportunity when we unlock it. So let's use today to work out how we can fight not the old, but build the new. Thank you.
Thanks, Stella. Am I on? Hi everyone, and good morning. My name is Matt Partridge, and I am the new regional organiser for Eastern London and the South East. First of all, I just want to thank Jim for his congratulations. I was busily writing notes for this at 3 in the morning, so that I think that indicates about when and how little sleep I was getting. But first of all, I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank the incredible NHS staff that supported my wife and I. They were real heroes through the most challenging times. We were really, really lucky that I was able to be there for the birth and other parents weren't. So, but I can't fault the NHS staff, many of who were massively overworked. I'd also like to thank all the key workers. Many of people on this call will be key workers themselves, or as a family who are key workers, who have been able to make this really important part of our lives as normal as possible. The fact that we were able to go out to shops still and buy essential nappies when we quickly run out, and bum cream and other essential stuff that all your parents will know about at 2 in the morning because of our heroic shop workers. I really must give credit to them and the work that all of you are doing in supporting them. So as regional organiser, I'll try not to take too much of your time because there's some fantastic sessions coming up, but as your regional organiser, I am here to support you, your branches, your candidates and your elected reps in all the essential work you're doing. And we have got some really important work ahead of us this year. Obviously, we've got hopefully, we're all working towards elections this May and elections in 2022 as well. But I think our movement, more than anything, and without repeating Jim and Stella, our movement is about getting work done now, and the incredible practical radicalism that we practice as cooperators. And so one of the most important things that I'm doing is supporting you as individual members to make the biggest impact in your communities through, as Stella says, that collective activism. And again, without repeating the great words that Jim and Stella have already said, this terrible disease through has only highlighted the cracks that already exist in our society, as the transmission lines are too often around the same faults that we had pre-COVID, those around poverty, precariousness of work, and the insecurity of not having a roof over your head. These are the same issues that our movement was founded on, and they are still the same issues we are fighting on today. And all these issues require mutual self-organized responses, which are already happening. I think we need to be really inspired by the work that's already happening in each of our communities, and we need to be using our collective power to support that and grow that for every community. I think increasingly as well, we are going to be the voice of that radical change that we need, and whether that's on the environment, the economy, or local decision making. Increasingly, those who are calling for radical change are not seen as the outliers anymore, and it's those that think that we can go back to the pre-COVID way of doing things are the ones who are burying their heads in the sand. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing what's going to come out of the policy debates and all the other discussions today, because I'm sure it's going to be really inspiring. So I'll hand over shortly to my colleague, and but first of all, I just look forward to meeting each and every one of you. Hopefully, it will be off Zoom sooner rather than later and out in your communities. But let me just say, have a great day. Thank you for everything you're doing, by the fact that you are joining us on your Saturday, particularly if you've got a day, today is a day off for you. It shows your commitment to changing the world to be a better place, which makes you an activist in itself. And the fact that you are a cooperator shows that you are an active, you're already practicing that collective activism. So let's grow it and let's build back better. And now I'll hand over to my colleague Chantal.
Thanks, Matt. Hi everyone, as Matt said, my name is Chantal Lee, and I am the new Equalities Officer for the Co-operative Party. I'm really honoured to be working in this new and exciting role, which really gives me the chance to highlight the party's commitment to a fairer society. We all know that we must do more to address the inequalities within our society. But as a party, we are and will continue to make great strides in this area. In terms of our progress on equalities, many of the things that we can appreciate today had to be really worked for, and that's including our gender-balanced NEC, having a BAME observer on the NEC, and ensuring that events like this that we hold on Zoom include closed captioning. But as a party and as a movement, we aren't complacent, and we want to go further. So some of the things that I'll be working on include setting up a new Equalities Advisory Committee, holding events with our fantastic diversity networks, supporting diverse candidates to come forward and seek selection and election, ensuring that they feel empowered, included, and supported throughout that process, and ensuring that the party looks like the communities that we serve. I know that all of you today will share our vision of a fairer and more equal society, and I really look forward to meeting you along our equalities journey. So if anything does spring to mind, or you've got an idea for something, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We want to do better. We want to continue our legacy of really championing equalities, and I look forward to doing that alongside all of you. So that's it from me. I'm going to be handing over to my colleague Anna, who works as our policy officer. Have a great conference, everyone, and thank you.
Hi, I Hi, my name's Anna. For those of you I've not met yet, I am the party's policy officer, and I am really excited that we launched our policy process this week. We're focusing on two topics, as we have done for many years, but something we did a bit differently this year was open it up to members to choose one of those topics through a vote. And hundreds of you took part, which was really exciting. So for those of you who didn't check your emails during the week, the policy topic that you chose as members was on how we reinvigorate our high streets. And we will be coming on to that later in the session today. And the other topic which the policy subcommittee thought was incredibly important was social care. And given the sort of crises and tragedies of the past year, particularly in our care homes, for example, this was a topic that is hugely relevant and urgent to resolve the challenges in. We've got some great panels coming up, but I wanted just to take a minute, if I may, to talk a little bit about how that process works. Our policy process is member-led, and we want to get all of the ideas, best practice, suggestions, and personal experiences from across our movement to help shape our policy. The ways you can do that are very easy and plentiful. You can respond as an individual. You can go to our website and you can let us know what you think and what you'd like the party's platform to look like on these two areas. You can get involved via your local party. Lots of parties every year organise policy debates. These happened really successfully online last year, and we put together lots of resources to enable you to hold successful online policy discussions. The deadline is June, so get them in early so that you've got plenty of time to get on dialogue and start campaigning for your local co-op candidates as well. And you can also get involved at our regional conferences, where we've got panels discussing the two policy topics with experts and people who have lots of experience. I can see on my screen that Rebecca from Leading Lives, for example, has joined us, and they're a fantastic example of what cooperative values in practice can look like in the care sector. And we'll be hearing from case studies all over the country. So I am really excited about this year's process. My email inbox is always open for your suggestions, ideas, and requests with our policy, and these will be put together into something that you can debate and vote on at our conference in the autumn. I'm just going to check with colleagues if our speakers for the first panel are here yet, as I can't see everybody on the screen, but we're going to be welcoming Lucy and Rebecca from Leading Lives, who are a social care cooperative. We're going to be hearing from Aaron Gain, who is an academic in this space and been doing lots of research and learning how cooperative models can improve the care offer. And also we're going to hear from Councillor Helen Dennis, who is one of our amazing Labour and Cooperative councillors in Southwark. You may have met Helen in her previous incarnation from the Fair Trade Foundation, but it's really exciting that she's been promoted and given responsibility for social care, among other things, in Southwark as part of their cabinet. So a really expert panel for you today. So I will start by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and go through some sort of opening remarks, and then if you want to ask questions and get involved in the discussion, then we have Slido, which is a Q&A box next to your video on your screen. It should be really easy just to type in any questions you fancy. I'll be keeping an eye out for your questions, contributions and comments, and I'll put them to the panel for you. You can also, if that's not working for you for whatever reason, or you're dialed in a different way, you can email events@party.coop and those questions will be passed over to me as well. So without further ado, because none of you have signed in just to hear from me. I am going to introduce Rebecca Steer and Lucy Humphrey. They're the Operations Director and Operations Manager and Vice Chair of the Leading Lives Board for Leading Lives, and they will do a far better job than I could at telling you a bit more about what Leading Lives do, why they're different, but needless to say, they're an inspiration in our sort of development of policy in this area, so I'm really thrilled they could join us. Rebecca and Lucy, I think you're unmuted, so just jump in whichever order you want to speak.
I didn't know whether you were going to put the little presentation up at all, or...
Yes, absolutely. Do you want me to share that first?
Do
you want to just introduce yourselves while I get that?
Hello, morning everybody on a Saturday morning. I'm Rebecca Steer and I work for Leading Lives based in Suffolk in East Anglia. And this is... Lucy, are you on mute? The first mute?
I'm Lucy Humphrey. I'm an Operations Manager for Leading Lives.
So that's who we are. And we work for Leading Lives, and I'll start. Can you find the little PowerPointy thing? I'll start anyway. So just to introduce ourselves in terms of our beginnings. So we were one of the first public sector mutuals that began. Can you hear me okay, everybody? Yeah, okay.
Yes, sorry, just a bit of feedback from Aaron.
That's okay. Wouldn't be the same meeting without it. Okay, so we were one of the first public sector mutuals that began trading in 2012. So originally we were delivering services within Suffolk County Council, and we transferred into this newly established company, Leading Lives, following a kind of devolvement programme. We were actually approached by the council at the time to say, would we be interested in divesting and going out and setting up our own company? So we were very keen to do that. And we spun out of the local authority with a block contract at the time. So we took the services we were managing with us, and we had 32 separate business units at that point. So we were sort of in 6 different business lines. So we took 450 staff with us, and at that point we had a kind of annual turnover of circa £11 million. And we migrated all these services. We took 1,200 customers with complex learning disability needs with us. So that was our kind of main business line, adults with learning disabilities. And we did this to kind of achieve step down financial targets that we had to make, and also to try and make our own surplus in our own rights. And we returned an annual trading surplus for 7 of the 8 financial years that we've been doing this. One year we had a struggle, and we have returned, and we have, with the surplus that we made, we, as part of our being a co-op, we invest back into the company firstly. So we use it to build reserves, we use it to develop new business lines, or purchase properties. We've now bought 5 properties since we've been Leading Lives. And we also allocate to a community benefit fund for, we set a criteria so it links back to our sort of values and mission. We've supported around 50 local projects in Suffolk with a value of about £140,000. And we also try and allocate a staff bonus and won various local and national awards over this period, sort of recognising some of the excellent work we do. So we do feel really proud of where we've got to since 2012, so 8 years ago, blimey. So the next phrase, our model is, we are a employee-led, not-for-profit social enterprise operating as an industrial provident society for the benefit of employees. This now obviously comes under the Co-operative Act. And as I said before, Leading Lives delivers a range of supports and services to adults with social care needs across Suffolk and into neighbouring counties. And most of our business is funded through contracts with local authorities, the NHS and private fee payers. Over to Lucy.
Okay, so in terms of how we engage with people. We have shareholder members, so everybody who is a permanent employee of Leading Lives can buy a share in the company after they've successfully progressed through their probation and induction, and they pay £1 for their share certificate, and that then makes them liable for £1 in the business. So there's no big liability for staff, but it gives them the voice, so they can then put themselves forward to being elected onto the employee board. We have certain subcommittees and stakeholder events that they get part of, and the board is elected by shareholders, and it is just shareholders that sit on our board, so we can have up to 15 elected members. Currently we have 10 elected members, and we have 2 ex officios who are sitting on the board as a result of the position that they have in the company. So we have the managing director and Becky's counterpart, another operations director, sitting on the board to help guide the elected shareholder employees. We do buy in or invite in certain external and internal experts into the board to get that external influence or that specialist support as and when we need to. So we don't have any non-exec directors sitting on our board, but like I say, if we have something around our accounts or finance, we contract with a financial accountancy, and we will invite them into the board to help us with any discussion. And the same, if we have legal discussion, we will invite our solicitors in, and they're an external firm that we use. So we have the shareholder council, and we try and encourage customer and family voice into the board and the shareholder council to help influence decisions and views that we make on behalf of the shareholders and the best interest of the company going forward. Go to the next slide, Anna. Okay, so there's obviously benefits, and you're all aware of the vast range of benefits being a co-op brings to any organisation. So, you know, you can think about how you pay your staff, you can encourage well-being and put a stronger emphasis on well-being and morale and motivation and engagement. Obviously, you are much more engaged in a co-op than an employee-owned business because it's run by the people within the business. The people who work for the business have a bigger say than they would in any other business. So they are the individuals with the first-hand knowledge and the expertise about what works and what doesn't work and what we need to think about for the future. So we do have a bit of a struggle with people putting on their strategic hat when they come into the board or our forums and not getting too involved in the day-to-day operational implementation of things. They've got to look at the bigger picture. And that's something that we really try and encourage people to think about. So like I say, we've got those forums that feed into the board. The other benefits are we share the surplus with our employees, and we're independent. We had a lot of bureaucracy and red tape when we were in the county council, and we have a lot less of that now. So there are a few barriers that we do find. We don't have that external influence sitting on the board, and sometimes it can be quite insular, the discussion in the board, and we do need to think about the outside world and what's going on in business. We don't have an independent chair who supports the managing director, and sometimes we get concerned about the strength of the board to challenge or to inform directorate team and hold them to account. We don't have any charitable status, and sometimes that limits our opportunities around funding and growth. And like I say, sometimes our shareholders do lack a bit of engagement. We have a bit of a concern sometimes that people sign up because they think they're going to get a surplus, but actually the reason why they should sign up is to have a voice and involvement in the organisation. We've done a lot of work recently on our culture, and we've reviewed whether we feel this model is right for us. And it's really positive that actually the outcomes of that is we have got the right model. We just need to work at it a bit more.
Brilliant, thank you both. Rather than taking questions straight away, if it's all right, we're going to hear from our other 2 speakers, and then we'll take some sort of questions in the round for everyone very shortly. So without further ado, I am going to invite up Aaron, if you are there, Aaron. I can see you. If you pop yourself off mute. Aaron? No, in which case, there we go. There's a couple of issues with your sound, Aaron. And we can't see you. There we go. Halfway there. Right. With apologies, we appear to have lost Aaron briefly. While we get Aaron back, Helen, are you ready to come on in instead? Sorry.
Sure. That's fine.
Great, lovely, thank you.
So hi everyone, and good morning, and thanks so much for the invitation. As Anna mentioned just at the start, I've been a co-operator for some time and a counsellor since 2015. Only a cooperative counsellor since 2018, but I'm also new into this cabinet roles. I got this role straight out of maternity leave in the middle of a pandemic, so I've got a lot to learn from everyone here. I'm very much here for the debate and also up for stealing lots of policy ideas from everyone else. I mean, I think it's fair to say all councils are completely overwhelmed at the moment by COVID and our response to the pandemic. The focus of our work at the moment has got to be on the day-to-day, supporting the NHS with the vaccination programme, ensuring that we do all we can to ensure safe discharge of COVID patients from hospital and to support ICU capacity by avoiding delayed transfers of care. And then, of course, doing the bread and butter work, ensuring that those residents in our care, our older population, those with mental health needs or learning and physical disabilities, along with their families and carers who have been doing such an amazing job through the crisis, are supported through this incredibly hard and stressful period. Longer term visioning work has been on hold to some degree, but in many ways this pandemic will have so much to teach us if we will listen, because systems are exposed in a time of crisis. And of course this discussion is really timely because whilst it's hard to live beyond just the day-to-day at the moment, in London at least we do have to set our minds to policy development and manifestos in preparation for 2022. So I think I've been invited to speak today in part because of Southwark's experience as one of the first signatories, along with Islington, to Unison's Ethical Care Charter in 2013. And without completely blowing our own trumpets, I really do think that this was one of those commitments that not only sounded like the right thing to do, but has been genuinely transformative for home care in the borough. I expect a lot of people are now familiar with the Ethical Care Charter, but just a quick rundown. So this requires the introduction and payment of the London living wage for all of our home care workers, for home care workers to be paid for their travel time, the payment of statutory sick pay, and also for occupational sick pay schemes to be in place, for visits to last at least 30 minutes, for training programmes to be integrated, and also for an end to 0 hours contracts. So initial monitoring just a few years in after we signed the charter showed really positive results in relation to staff recruitment and retention, staff satisfaction and training. And whilst it was a big upfront investment, what we hoped for over the long term has come to pass. Budget savings, if you invest in supporting people to live independently in their own homes through really good home care, also reablement, and avoiding costly residential placements. So fast forward to the last year in the pandemic, and this commitment has really demonstrated its worth, with our home care staff properly supported to self-isolate, and of course many of them in that workforce are female and from Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, thus protecting them, their families and those for whom they were caring. In relation to the testing and vaccination programmes, there have been real challenges because of fragmentation in the sector, but Southwark also fought really hard to get testing out, regular testing, to domiciliary workers at the earliest opportunity. And we've been seeking to include anyone who is paid for through a direct payment, also to be included within the care workforce for the purposes of the vaccination programme. Of course, a lot of focus during the pandemic has been on residential care and older people's homes in particular. And I think maybe the creation of the Infection Control Fund in of itself was perhaps an admission that the amount of money going into residential care hasn't been sufficient to ensure decent terms and conditions. In Southwark, our ambition for some time has been to build on the Ethical Care Charter and to develop a residential care charter, essentially using our powers as a commissioner to try and deliver more social value, albeit within a flawed marketised system. So we're in the process of initial consultation, having run some online surveys and interviews with staff, management, residents and their carers in the autumn. This won't be entirely simple, as we're not the sole purchaser of beds across our care homes. And also important to say, we're talking about all residential care settings, so not just older people's care. But we are determined to find a way to make this work. And I would love to speak with other local authorities as well on this, as we will be more powerful in turning the tide if we work together. One of our related challenges in Southwark, which I know will paint a very different picture from other local authority areas, is the lack of in-borough provision of nursing homes. We have just 2 at the moment, and I wouldn't necessarily rely on both of those for the long term because of the market pressures we're all aware of. And in particular, we have just the issue of how expensive land is in Southwark. I think it's fair to say that we have a bit of a market failure. So this has led us to make our own council commitment to deliver 2 new nursing homes ourselves, one of which should be open in January 2022. Whilst I would love for these to be cooperatives, that isn't the current state of play. Options have been explored in the past, but not realised. But to develop our vision and our offer around this, we established a co-design group, which has been involved in interviewing potential management partners. And I really want that principle, not just of kind of service user involvement, but proper co-design and participation to be embedded going forward. And of course, that's the case across all of our services, and not just in this instance. I think finally, from a local perspective, I also just want to reflect on the grassroots community action and mutual aid that we've all seen, I know, across all of our local authority areas spring up in response to the pandemic. I think it's shown us all that there is a continuum of social care. It's not just about statutory provision, which, as we know, is limited by thresholds. This is about how we can harness all the care and support networks available within our community to be stronger going forward and make sure that no one falls through the net. So this is why we're setting up locally the Southwark Community Support Alliance to ensure that support for the most vulnerable can really be strengthened with a strong referral process in place and genuinely ensuring that there is no wrong front door to access support. Of course, and I'll just end on this, of course, what we really need from national government is a long-term vision for social care and a sustainable funding settlement, which doesn't rely on a regressive social care precept to plaster over the wounds. This shouldn't just be about how care is paid for, but also how it's delivered. The market model is clearly broken, and COVID has exposed this like never before in a system with fragmentation, 3/4 of care workers on poverty pay below the real living wage, and an absence of occupational sick pay. Lots of contradictions in the system, companies with high levels of debt whilst continuing to pay out dividends to millionaire directors. I would argue that it's so broken that when the Labour Party is back in power, we shouldn't shy away from a real revolutionary moment in relation to social care. But I'm afraid that for now, I am rather pessimistic about it all. And given the direction of travel within NHS governance towards ICSs, which feel very distant and unaccountable, talk of integrating health and social care must be interrogated quite carefully. Of course, I think we all want a more level playing field in terms of funding, perhaps free personal care. Of course, we want a more coherent and seamless system for our residents. But I don't think we really want social care commissioning, if that's what we're stuck with at the moment, to move away from local authorities. I'm certainly not convinced, but maybe something that we can debate. Social care is about how we look after one another in our local communities. And so it's my firm view that for now, local authorities need to be the ones in the driving seats, making the most of our local knowledge and our commissioning levers to try and promote cooperative values and organisations as best as we're currently able. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Helen. And we've had a few questions already come in asking for a copy of the social care charter that Southwark Council passed. So do forward that on so that I can circulate to anybody who gets in touch who's interested in doing similar in their own council. As a councillor in next door Lambeth, I'd certainly be very keen to do some of the things that Southwark's been doing as well. So we'll pick that up. And I think, you know, what we've heard from both Helen, Rebecca and Lucy is the importance of local decision making and empowerment. It's not about creating top-down models. It's, you know, this dangerous shift that we're seeing, as Helen points out, in the NHS, away from the people who really understand the needs of the people who use care and the people who deliver care. And so really good to get both of those perspectives in the way that local government and local organisations, particularly cooperative models, can work together to co-design and co-produce services is really interesting and important. So thank you very much. I am also thrilled that we can welcome back Aaron, I think. So Aaron, how are you getting on? I could see you just now, and this, I think I can hear you as well. Aaron? Right, I have a feeling that that is still not quite right, so I'll get my colleagues.
And I can't hear you. It's freeze, screen's freezing. Can anyone hear me okay?
We can hear you, Aaron.
Sorry, I'm struggling here. I can't hear you.
Right, I'm going to take a few questions for the speakers we've had so far, Aaron, and then while my colleagues try and work out what's up at your end, and we'll bring you in shortly, if that's okay. So a reminder to anyone wanting to ask questions, you can use the chat boxes on your screen next to the video, and I've had lots come in already. So I'm going to have a quick look through. Becky says, does the fundamental issue of social care not being properly funded prevent cooperative social care growing, or are there other barriers? And sort of a query, anonymous, but I think it's an interesting one. Is customer the best way to describe people that we help through social care? And how should we talk about people who use your services and as sort of in an empowering way? And a question from Sandy around how the profile of your income has changed since being coming out of the county council. So has it fundamentally changed the model on how you work? So a couple of questions specifically there for Leading Lives, but also sort of a wider question around, actually, are there barriers beyond funding, which I think Helen touched on a little bit. So Helen, did you want to touch on that? And then I'll bring in Lucy and Rebecca to also comment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's quite clear that the lack of sustainable funding and the commissioning model will therefore result in a much harder environment for cooperatives, mutuals, those organisations with a social purpose to be able to be competitive, because that is the frame. And obviously what we've seen is potentially a kind of race to the bottom in many areas, which is why it's been so challenging for many local authorities to try and kind of pay a real living wage through the commissioning process, for example. You know, we've got really limited pots of funding. It's getting worse and worse. Everyone's in really tough budget negotiations at the moment. So it wasn't an easy thing for us, for example, to make the commitments around the Ethical Care Charter. And I think there were probably lots of questions from other local authorities at the time about how on earth we were able to do that, given the circumstances. So I think what we can do, and it's what I was trying to bring across, I suppose, but we've still got a long way to go on this. We haven't got it perfect, but is to use kind of commissioning and procurement powers that we have to really try and build up that piece on social value, so that we are kind of leveling the playing field a bit more for those organisations that are not just driven by profit but by social ethos.
No, absolutely. And sort of Lucy and Rebecca, did you want to come in on that point, and maybe also sort of a little more detail on how being sort of separate to the council has changed some of the ways that you operate and your income structures?
Well, we can concur with Helen. The budgets are getting tighter, so if there's a tender out there, you know, it's what you can provide for this kind of real tight cash envelope, and you do have to look at it. Although you do realise when you spin out from a council, there is still, where there was still lots and lots of savings that could be made, and efficiencies where we certainly realised that, you know, we obviously had to cut quite a bit of management when we moved out, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, because we kind of moved the finances down to the front line, because that's what we needed to do. And sometimes we lived in a world of luxury 8 years ago, you know, when you really look back on it, and we've just seen that there are efficiencies that can be made and smarter and quicker ways of doing things, and there's a lot of waste. And so we've had to kind of adapt to the tightening purse strings, but they are really, really tight now, and they do impact, as Helen talked about, in terms of being able to pay your staff and deliver those services. So it's an aspiration for us to meet the national living wage. We're not there yet. We pay above the national minimum wage, but that's still something literally we're working on now, following a new restructure, confidentially.
I can't promise confidentiality, as you are.
I know, because you're recording. I know it's not.
No, it's good. It's really positive to hear that direction of travel. And the question around, do we use the word customer? Does that just sort of
that's a really, really good point. And
the fact that it's a marketized system.
Yeah, and it probably was when we started, because we've had service users and there's clients and all the kind of, it's a collective word, and it's quite an anonymizing word, and I totally concur to it. It's a habitual collective word. Generally in our everyday today is about people who use our services and individuals, but we tend to use this collective word. It is pretty revolting. So I do recognise that. It's a bit like we're trying to move away from saying staff and saying colleagues, because it's just, just how
I think customer though,
vernacular. Go on then.
Customer does give the power back to the individuals who are using the service. And like Becky says, we've moved away from client and we've moved away from service user because they're disempowering, but actually they are purchasing a service of us. And it's important that the staff understand that they are the ones that are purchasing the service, and that we're there to do the best that we can do for those individuals. And like Becky says, when we talk about it, when we're at work, it's individuals who use the service, people, and people by their name. It's not, we don't refer to people as customer, client, service user. So yeah, it's an interesting debate that we have internally all the time.
Once a conclusion has been reached, do let me know, so that I make sure that I'm writing policy that is the most empowering it can be. So yeah, keep in touch. I think I've got Aaron back. So I'm going to give this another go. Hi, Aaron. Yeah. I'm going to add you to my screen. Aaron, you've got a presentation you'd like sharing, is that right?
That's right. It's a simple presentation. It's just a few slides.
In which case, I'm going to ask, I think my colleague Izzy is going to share that. Lovely. There we go.
They can.
Off you go.
Sorry about the tech problems. I'm on my third laptop in 20 minutes. So we've got there in the end. So apologies for that.
I'm very grateful for the continued effort.
That's right. If I just do, I've only got a few slides, and I thought I'd just introduce myself and the research I've done, but really about opening up to colleagues. Really, it's not an in-depth sort of analysis of what I've done, but I thought I'd just introduce it, and then hopefully share some thoughts and questions and answers with everybody in the room. So really, really grateful for the opportunity. So if I just give a brief background, I'm Aaron Gain. I'm currently actually an NHS local authority commissioner, and in my spare time I did a PhD on social enterprises, and particularly around employee engagement in health and social care at the University of Sussex. And I've recently completed that work, and I think it's quite relevant to the debate that I think you've been having. I've been trying to hear over the last sort of half an hour or so. What I thought I'd do is, if I just briefly introduce a couple of the key findings and then open it up to the specific impact, I think, and implications for social care going forward. So my major question was, I was looking at, does ownership matter? So I was looking at employee-owned social enterprises and trying to compare them with public sector and private and other types of health and social care providers. And I particularly looked at the issue of employee engagement and non-managerial, non-hierarchical ways of working. So looking at issues around workplace democracy, engagement of employees. So looking at the way in which different clinical, social work, care professionals engage with their work. So it wasn't a quantitative analysis, it was qualitative. So it's focusing on the experience of the workforce. So I looked at different case studies and looked at the different ownership models and compared them basically over about a 5 or 6 year period as a sort of longitudinal study. And if I just go down, just make sure I can go down to the next slide. So there a second. They're my findings. That's right. Particularly, so the 4 main findings I think are relevant. One was there were lots of different examples of owner control in the employee-owned organisations, which were different from the other private and public organisations. There were examples of voting on surpluses, end-of-year surpluses. There was internal citizen juries where you would group staff from a range of different departments and get them to try and answer a particular problem or project or business strategy that you're trying to come up with, that sort of cut across normal sort of management sort of expertise. And overall, there was quite a lot of challenging of conventional sort of managerialism. And what I mean by that is not that I'm not being anti-manager in that sense. It's not a personal thing. It's just trying to challenge existing ways in which we manage these sort of problems. And there was quite a lot of examples of doing that, both and I mean managerialism in the public sector can have a lot of managerialism as well as sort of private sector. So it's sort of quite a good example from the employee-owned organisations to really sort of challenge those ways of working. So there was number 3, I think, in comparison, there were significantly improved levels of staff engagement. And one of the important things I discovered, I think, was that the employee-owned people in the health and social care bodies had a higher degree of equality and a sense of self-worth. There was quite a lot of the idea that employee ownership and having a share and having an input in the organisation and owning it provided that sort of foundation and a baseline that gave them the confidence to engage in the organisation. So rather than you engage in the organisation anyway, you look at it slightly different and say, well, ownership gave people some confidence and training and some ability and self-worth to then engage. It was like a precondition for engagement later on. One thing I did wanted to say before going on really, which is that I think there's a danger of when you study employee-owned organisations, cooperative working and non-conventional ways of organisational working, is that there's often 2 sets of conventional thinking going on here. There's one set of conventional thinking that sort of argues that these organisations don't work. And there's an assumption that you have to have a manager in place and you have to have a hierarchy. So there's a conventional wisdom that seems to suggest that these organisations are inevitably going to fail in some form. And strangely enough, there's also a opposite conventional thinking, which is about which is quite a romantic view of these organisations, which they are essentially conflict-free and they work really well, and the mechanisms work really well around direct engagement of staff. And I think my study suggests that both of those conventional views are quite extreme, and that reality is that participation is quite arduous. Actually, it's quite difficult. It's very rarely successful very quickly. So just because it's difficult doesn't mean it's not valued by staff, but we can't really have a romantic view of engagement in that way. It was incredibly difficult for lots of different people. And if I just go to my next slide just quickly, this is a slide that just tries to sum up how in employee organisations, the idea that they have a tendency to have more and greater levels of participation by staff than other organisations. And this is a model that's used by quite a lot of academics in this world, in this field, that distinguishes between low levels of information giving at number 1 and quite high levels of in control by employees at number 5. And there's obviously steps in between that you move up those steps. In very simple terms, employee-owned social enterprises tended to be between 3 and 5 on those steps, and other organisations tended to be between 1 and 3. So there was a marked difference in the level of participation by staff within employee-owned organisations. So that was the sort of the research that I've just completed just at the end of last financial year. And when I was thinking about what that actually meant for social care, because these organisations that I studied did a mixture of health and social care, that was a bit of NHS work, bit of private sort of personal care. Some of it was also social care from local authorities commissioned. So it's a whole mixture. And when I looked at, well, what would it actually mean, particularly for social care funding and the future that we're looking at, if I could just quickly go to the last slide, was that there seems to be two sort of things that I think might be helpful for us to think through, which was that there is an increasing body of knowledge, both sort of academic and in know-how and practical information that people have, that cooperatives are quite good at this area of work. And I know that sounds a very simplistic statement, but lots of people have made the case for co-ops in social care. The why question, and why are they good, is a really clear one. There are lots of really good reasons for why co-ops work. And in particular around social care, that case is really clear. There's a distinctiveness of the caregiving process. As I know colleagues have mentioned earlier today, there is something special about caregiving, which means that cooperatives, employee owned, and the different types of organisations are really well placed to do that. And one way you might want to think of this is that, how can we talk about co-production with clients or patients or service users, whatever we call them, if we can't co-produce with our own staff? If you can't engage your own staff, you're not going to have much chance of engaging the client or the patient as well. So you've got some real distinctiveness around social care. You've also got a real connection between the idea of professionalism and professional care workers and democratic workplaces, because professionals themselves are very unmanagerial in their disposition. They don't assume hierarchy works, and they don't assume management know what they're doing a lot of the time. They have a basic connection with some of the work that we're doing around cooperatives and employee owned. And also this issue about psychological ownership, really important that staff don't just legally own an organisation or are involved in the co-op, but they also feel a high level of commitment to those organisations. And that element of psychological ownership is really high in cooperatives and employee-owned organisations. So some of those, the case for why cooperatives are good is, I think, really well made. And I think you can remake it, but I don't think the research that's needed is about that anymore. I think we really need to think about giving policymakers more detail about how it might work, and also being really self-reflective about the barriers to change. So why do people think that cooperatives won't work in this area? What do they think are wrong about cooperatives, and really challenge those barriers and the disadvantages of cooperatives up front, and really sort of tackle them first, rather than make the case for why cooperatives are good again and again, because I think it's been made quite a few times, and we really probably need to think about the how and the barriers. And there's loads of issues there that we could talk about. You know, there's obviously a changing policy environment. There's lots of short-termism. And one of the things that the evidence suggests around cooperatives and employee-owned is that a lot of the advantages of cooperatives and employee-owned organisations is that those benefits rarely happen in the short term. That most of the benefits around employee-owned cooperatives, about employee engagement, societal engagement, takes some time to actually come to fruition. And so really important tension between sort of policy objectives, which are quite short term, and the idea about cooperatives and employee owned being quite medium to long term, some of its benefits. So there's lots of issues around that. And also, I wouldn't underestimate the last 2 points I've got on my list there, around insufficient development of staff. That one of the things that I found was that staff found participation in their organisation actually quite difficult, because it's quite challenging, and you have to learn and develop yourself, and it can be not just in times wise, it's quite emotionally committed. High levels of emotional commitment are needed. So there's quite a lot of development staff that's needed, and there's also quite a severe lack of technological solutions for engaging staff in their organisations. The organisations that I studied were still paper-based in terms of the engagement of staff. So all votes were based on paper-based mechanisms, which made it quite difficult. It made the admin costs quite high, the transactional costs of engagement really, really high in these organisations. So I think there's a whole range of things that we need to look at to make the case for social care and cooperatives. And I personally think they're a lot more about the how, and they're a lot more about being upfront about what the barriers are to change. But they're not impossible by any means. But they certainly need to. I think they need to be addressed a lot more fully than probably the why. So is that just a quick summary? And I assume that people will be able to hear what I said.
Great, and you'll be pleased to know that someone's already written saying we'd like to read your PhD papers. So I'll get their details for you. But thank you, and I think that it is important to think about how we make cooperating easy. We know that it is a model that is fairer and that makes things more equal and that can deliver better outcomes both for staff and for everybody who uses those services and their families. So the easier we can make it to do that, the better. There's been a couple of, we've prompted a debate in the chat about how we talk about people who use social care services. And there's a good point from Mervyn. I think we've heard a lot around employee ownership today, and you know, there are huge benefits of employee ownership, but actually what other cooperative models are there, and how can we be sort of a multi-stakeholder model, and perhaps then those customers shift from people who use services to people who shape services, and then there are members as well as sort of staff being members. And I think that's a really interesting one. I can see some nodding from Rebecca, and I don't know if it's one you wanted to jump in on.
Could you enable my video? Sorry, I think it's working now.
Okay,
all right.
There we go. Let's give that a
Thank you very much. I haven't got two heads, honest. There we go. Can you hear me?
Lovely.
Let's see me. Thank you. That's
much better. So Rebecca first, because I think you were nodding. You may well have been nodding when I couldn't see you, Aaron, but if you want to hop in after that, please please feel free.
Yes, I totally agree. As Lucy said, although we have the kind of model where our employees are part of the membership, the whole emphasis on co-production in terms of involving the people who use our service, their family carers, and working with the council and other people, other organisations, is very much at the heart of what we do anyway. So we do a lot of work with our people. We would make a lot of accessible information. We have advisory groups in our services where people meet to debate different kind of subjects and things. If we want to change things, we want to develop things. Obviously, with the whole COVID situation, our services have just gone bonkers, and we're having to completely reshape and redo all our services and go also down a digital route, which is quite scary for everybody in Suffolk. Has got very bad broadband anyway, but we've got to work with our people to kind of look at how we can deliver services in a completely different way if we don't actually open some of our buildings again. So there is a lot of involvement with people. So I don't know whether people can become actual members of the co-op in the co-op sense, because it's an employee-owned co-op.
Yeah.
But in terms of the actual day-to-day involvement, that's the whole part of our world. You can't create services or supports if people don't want them, and you need to ask them what they want, and we have to change. And we certainly learnt that when we spun out from Suffolk County Council, that we had to change how we deliver some of the things, because we've been doing the same thing since the 80s, and you've got to go with the times. So bit of an inarticulate answer.
No, I think that's
great. I agree.
That's a good comment. Did you want to jump in, Aaron, quickly?
No, I was just going to say that there are. What I found was that there, and this is a positive finding, I think, of my research, which was that cooperatives and employee-owned organisations, and I know there are differences between each of those. You know, there's some legal organisational differences and things, but as a whole, that group of those types of organisations were distinctively better at engaging their staff and their service users or patients, whatever we want to call them. That is a real strength, and because it's a real strength, it's something we should be emphasising and make connections with the whole issue about co-production. These types of organisations are just better at it, and councils themselves were actually quite good at it, much better than some private organisations I looked at, and also much better than the NHS. The NHS struggles with some of this because it's it's quite a hierarchical organisation for all its strengths and stuff, but in terms of sort of giving like their clinicians and their service users or patients much more in empowerment, it really did struggle quite a lot. So I think cooperatives have got a real strength in this area, and it's something that we really got to emphasise much more. For all it's never a perfect thing, and that's one of the things I want to emphasise, is that there is a danger to over romanticize cooperative working. Sometimes it's really hard work. There's some, it's constant sort of struggle to engage staff all the time and come up with new ways. It's constantly something that you have to reinvent and re-engage all the time. But it's so much better. It's really significantly better from the public sector and the private organisations I looked at.
Fabulous, and I'm sure I'm guilty of over romanticizing co-ops, but they are so good. It's
a balance here, isn't there?
I think it's in the job description. I'm conscious of time, and that we've kept you all for a little while. There's been lots of discussion in the Slido chat around how we get the balance right between integrated, joined up services and not siphoning funding away from social care, not taking away that sort of empowerment that you get through local government and cooperative models, all sorts of discussion. So we could be here for hours, and I'm not going to inflict that on anybody on their Saturday morning. So I'm just going to say a big thank you to Helen, Lucy, Rebecca and Aaron. Really good. You're the first debate of our policy process 2021, and I'm really thrilled that we had so much sort of knowledge and expertise and real life experience on our call, and the discussion from members shows that I think it's been a really engaging session. Social care is so complicated, and I think if nothing else, as well as demonstrating the value that co-op and co-production models bring, just the sheer complex nature of the sector is really apparent when we talk about all the different sort of funding streams and challenges and stakeholders. If people are having local discussions on this sector, I put together a presentation on a bit of the Social Care 101 that's available on our policy page on the website to help guide some of the discussion. So do use that and email me if there are anything that isn't clear. Anyway, I'm gonna say thank you to these guys, and I can see Nick and Evie for my next session. So we're gonna move rapidly from social care to the high street. So thank you to all of these speakers, and to sort of introduce our next session. We are going to be talking about how we reinvigorate our high street, and high streets have been something that I can't remember the exact figures, but there was some really interesting polling done about something that people missed and what would make them feel like we were getting back to normal after the last year that we've had, and being able to enjoy town centres and go back to the high street was ranked really highly. So I think just as we can't return to business as usual in social care, we can't return to business as usual in our high streets either, partly because high streets have changed. Shops that we've always sort of recognised in local places are closing. We've had lots of sort of high profile large national chains announce sort of branch closures or full scale end of trading, but we've also seen people's shopping habits change and a renewed appreciation for buying local, and I think what Nick and Evie are going to be able to really highlight and bring out, hopefully, from this discussion, is that actually we all have a huge role to play as a community and as individuals and as councillors and cooperators in shaping the high streets that we want to see and creating something that is reflective of local need and the local character, and sort of building sort of community cohesion and that sense of togetherness that we might have felt, at least on Thursdays when we've clapped or via our mutual aid groups. So I am going to bring in Evie first, as she's virtually travelled the furthest and is joining us from Dumfries. Evie's the chair of the Mid-Steeple Quarter, which anyone who knows me knows that I've been banging on about how much I find Dumfries really inspiring, where the community is getting together to make sure that empty shops are a thing of the past in Dumfries, and where the community is able to shape and support businesses to move into them through cooperative and community share models. So Evie, I'm going to hand straight over to you, if that's okay.
Of Of course. Thank you. That was really kind as well. A really nice introduction. Thanks for having me. I've got a little bit of slides I'd like to share, if that's okay. Let me get organised. Can I do that? That's what I can. Here we go. Here we go. Right, hopefully we're cooking the gas and everybody can see that. Okay, lovely, right. Thanks for having me. As Anna said, my name is Evie Copeland. I'm the chair of Mid-Steeple Quarter in Dumfries. And I hope I touch on the points that you kind of mentioned there. Fingers crossed. But I guess it'll be time for some questions at the end, if not. So this is a tale of taking back our high street in Dumfries. And I thought I'd start with me. So this is me as a kid. I'm a lifelong Doonhamer, and this matters to me more than anything I think I've ever come across in my life, that our town comes back to the place that, you know, I remember it being thriving, full of people, and most importantly, that people live in the heart of our town again. And I think what I'm going to go through today is just the journey of how far we've come, what we've done, and how important the community's been in making that happen. So this is Dumfries High Street, and this is a bit of a sort of pre-glow up Dumfries High Street, Mid-Steeple Quarter. It's a market town without a market, a bit like a coal town without any pits, and kind of lost its sparkle in more ways than one, quite clearly from this image. But the place has such potential. At the time that Mid-Steeple Quarter started, 70 units on our high street were empty. The big brand chains were closing at that time. The only sort of big nationals that we had still in place were Debenhams and Marks and Spencers, and Debenhams has announced a closure in our high street just earlier on, towards the end of last year. So shop space has been a really, really important thing on the agenda locally for a really long time, but the solutions that were being proposed just weren't working and something had to change. So this, I guess, is the story of the people power here. And it all started with an organisation called the Stove Network in Dumfries, which is a creative and cultural collective of artists who looked at the last house on the high street, essentially. So at that point, there was only one person really living in the heart of the town. And prior to that, in the past, the area that is Mid-Steeple Quarter was a really important part for printing. That's where a lot of the newspapers were based. 200 people worked in the town centre every single day, and that was gone. And this film kind of started and sparked a bit of discussion about, you know, what should happen next. So we kind of thought, well, look, Europeans do it. People live and love the hearts of the sort of urban space there. Why couldn't we do it here? And this area particularly that we're looking at, the quarter on the high street, lends itself really well to outdoor space that people can enjoy, but also the sort of ground level shop, enterprise or cultural space, with obviously first floor up for people to re-inhabit. So the Mid-Steeple Quarter was born, and it really reimagines that strip of shops, but also the sort of first level up to bring people back into the town centre to live. And I think, you know, one of the points that you touched on was councils, and I think Dumfries and Galloway Council here have been hugely important and instrumental in moving this forward. Their Town Centre Living Fund, which is essentially second homes profit for them, is put back into town centre regeneration and project funding for organisations just like Mid-Steeple Quarter to take forward ideas to transform the hearts of towns across our region. And for us, we used that to kind of get started, essentially. So there was a building that we looked to take into community ownership, and that was an asset transfer of what we call the Baker's Oven, a former baker's in the town, and build Dumfries High Street, the community benefit society that helped us kind of get this up and running. Begin to kind of start the community engagement, because all of this relies on the people, and get some staff in place to help us make it happen. So we launched the Community Benefit Society, and our Doontown Army, which anybody that knows Dumfries, we're Doonhamers, and the Doontown Army took to the streets to begin to make things happen. Time to change. You know, we've got our local provost and elected members all came together to start this. So it was a combination of all sorts of people, kids, performers, and I think that creative engagement and the other ways to get people talking about it and working on things in a different way has really been part of the solutions to help us move this forward. So this here, the one in pink outlined is the oven. So that's our kind of flagship project. This is the first one that the first building of the 9 that we'll look at that we brought into community ownership. This was an asset transfer from the local authority, which obviously was a massive contribution to help us get started. We launched that back in 2018, and again, you know, as a sort of talking point on the high street, that building had been empty for years. It had been used as a sort of pop-up charity shop effectively by the local authority that enabled local groups to come in and use it for a day or two. This turned it now into a community space that was going to be used in a different way. So we've held consultations a lot of the time run out of there, art installations, gallery functions, people can come and do pop-up events or shops or markets, that kind of thing happens in there. So it's just repurposing it already. So this is what it's going to be. This will be 6 flats and shop space down in the bottom, which will extend the building on where it is just now. This is the ground floor. So we'll have at the front end, at the high street side, will be sort of shop space that's open towards the middle. This will be creative space that can be extended into a large space or split down into 4 smaller spaces, and then a creative studio with a residence at the very back. This is the space that we're working with. So this whole sort of chunk in the middle, the 9 buildings, is the mid-steeple quarter, and this is what we'll hope to do. So it'll be transforming it from primarily empty space into homes and cultural and enterprise space on the ground floor, and looking at things a bit differently. So, you know, Anna mentioned in the beginning about buying local. A lot of what we're looking at now is, you know, that, like, we haven't got anything in the town anymore, bakers, grocers, things that people can access from the window or from a shop front, as opposed to having to go around and browse post-COVID, and certainly to allow people to open back up in a way that's sustainable right now. And this is just, again, a cutaway just to give you an impression of the potential of the space that we're considering, and I have huge ambitions to fulfil. I guess if you're really interested in this, I would absolutely advise go and check out our master plan, which will give you way more detail than I'll be able to today, but you'll find that on our website, and it just gives the full detail about the phases of the project, including acquisition of the rest of the buildings, which is what I'll move on to now. So next stage after the oven was attempting to get ownership of these 2 buildings. So these ended up coming up for auction. We were unsuccessful. We managed to raise £25,000 and a crowdfunder to help us go and buy these, and it was the first time that we'd been in a sort of competitive environment to try and buy back these buildings. They ended up going for way above what they were worth, and it was a difficult process for us because nobody had shown any interest in the town until, you know, things started to happen. And unfortunately, that's the reality when things do start to happen, that it becomes quite attractive for outside investment. However, in the last 2 years, we've got to a point that, you know, this is the before and this is the after, and these are back into community ownership. So we've been able to fund and source the funds to buy these back. So we've now got, you know, the buildings that were and the buildings that are now. So we've now got the smithy, the press, again going back to that sort of printing heritage, that 3 buildings out of this space now are in community ownership and used by the people of Dumfries, with ambitions to deliver the house in and the shop space reimagined on the ground floor. And I guess the next step for us, and one of the things I wanted to just touch on today, is another crowdfunder. So in our journey to reclaim the high street, we need to get to a point that, you know, there is absolute community ownership in there. And for us now, we're really urging local people that are following us, local business, to help us purchase the remaining 3 buildings. at the other end of the quarter, which are 109, 111 and 121, which would allow us to have full site access to begin to really make things happen and get people back into the heart of town. And I guess, you know, one thing about COVID is it gives us a little bit of downtime to try and make things happen and, you know, move things along so that when people do get back into town, you know, things are radically different. So, yeah, and I guess just for the purposes of everybody, just to show you where we are, we have 135 to 139, that's in community ownership, 113 to 115, 117 belong to the people of Dumfries, and the other two at the far end, and the one in the middle at 121 are the ones that we're pursuing just now. So I guess at the heart of it, you know, communities are completely powerful. The local authority has tried and, you know, failed. There's not been that collective approach to making something happen and delivering change in the heart of our town. And, you know, I think the way that we're doing it has just changed the face of what's, you know, potentially ahead of us and what can happen. And even Burns, you know, this is the last place that Burns was before he died, is 100% behind reclaiming the high street. So that'll be a real focus for us next week from Monday for obviously the anniversary of his for Burns Night. We'll be really hitting that hard to try and get some more support behind us on the crowdfunder. But again, I think the whole ethos of our project is it's, you know, people powered and for everyone. So that's me, Anna. Oh, that's okay. But if there's anything else I can
more than okay. That was fantastic, and I'm sure that if you wanted to share a link to your crowdfunder on the we'd be very happy to help share that to attendees too, as a thanks for the virtual journey down from north of the border, and we'll toast you on Burns Night on Monday too. So thank you very much. If it's all right, rather than take questions straight away, Evie, I'm going to bring in Nick from Power to Change to be able to talk a bit about how this, I guess, community ownership might apply not just in Dumfries, but sort of everywhere, and some of the work that Power to Change have been leading. And it's lovely to see Nick in his new incarnation. We've been lucky enough to welcome Nick in his previous role at Locality as well, so a good friend of the Co-op Party. So I will hand straight over, Nick, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks very much, Anna. And yeah, just to echo Anna's point, mid-steeple quarter is something that's really inspiring to us at Power to Change, and would really urge everyone to go and donate to the crowdfunder, because it's not only important for Dumfries, it's important for the rest of the country that we can see mid-steeple quarter being successful. So yeah, all power to you, Evie. Just a little bit of background about Power to Change for those that don't know us. So we're independent charitable trust. We support and develop community business across England, but yeah, often looking jealously north of the border to Scotland. And kind of at the heart of our vision is that we believe that no one understands the community better than the people that live there. And we work with community businesses to kind of put some of that power into practice through helping them revive local assets, protect the services that people rely on, and address local needs. And many of those community businesses, but not all of them, are cooperatives. So just wanting to kind of think about the challenges that are facing town centres and high streets kind of pre-COVID, and how COVID might have changed some of this. So I think it's kind of well understood now that the kind of retail dominated model has been dying for quite a while, in part driven by out of town shopping centres, online shopping as well. But I think evidence suggests this is only going to be accelerated by the pandemic. Retailers and businesses with a strong online offer have fared better, those without haven't. And you've seen the kind of stock price of multinationals like Amazon shoot up while others have gone out of business, sadly. I do think there is some hope through COVID. I think there's potential for kind of secondary high streets that might not be the kind of very core of a town or a city, and that might have been neglected to see more activity as people spend more time closer to home. I think that's a real opportunity. And things like the idea of the 15-minute city, where you can access everything you need within a 15-minute walk from your house, which has been pushed by Mayor Hidalgo in Paris. Things like that are attracting a lot of interest in kind of policy circles at the moment, which again, I think is an opportunity. Equally, I think there's also recognition among developers and property owners that they need to diversify. So if they're to continue receiving rent on their property, they need to increase footfall. And one of the ways of doing this is through kind of introducing a more diverse range of businesses to the high street. So community businesses, cooperatives that might run art centres, community pubs, places offering creative activities and so on. I also think there's a recognition among councils, as Evie mentioned, the council have been really kind of instrumental in Dumfries, that they need to play a more activist role in their town centres if they're to halt their decline. You can't leave it to the kind of whims of the market because that isn't working, it hasn't been for some time. And I think importantly, we are beginning to see the kind of future models of a civic high street, which is fit for the 21st century. So we're seeing them in places like Dumfries, but also places like Plymouth, Hastings, and elsewhere, which I'll talk about in a little bit of detail later on. But I think all of this is happening kind of in spite of the system, and our role is to change the system. So these places are no longer the exception to the rule, but the kind of norm as we go forward, and that's where I hope we can get. And Evie's touched on it, Anna's touched on it, but I think they're such an important, high streets and town centres are such an important thing in people's consciousness because they're sources of civic pride. I was reading Deborah Mattinson's book recently, Beyond the Red Wall, and there's a really interesting anecdote in there speaking to people in those places, and she talked about the importance of the presence on the high street of a Marks and Spencer's. It's widely respected high street brand, lots of kind of connections with British history, for people's perceptions of their local place. If there was a Marks and Spencer's, they felt pretty good. If there wasn't, they were feeling pretty miffed about their place. So I think we need to ask ourselves how we move to a point where people's pride in the high street is not only driven by the presence of a particular retailer, which M&S is great, does lots of good things, but instead by a kind of diverse mix of uses and businesses. High street should be hubs of activity that people know and feel comfortable in. Often they are, too often they're not. We should be seeing things like health and wellbeing hubs in community businesses and cooperatives on the high street as places that people go and use and able to access a range of services. And I think the other thing that I've touched on is just how important these community-owned spaces are as a kind of way of attracting people to a local high street. They draw people in. A few examples that we've covered in research we've done in recent years. Places like Bodmin Old Library in Bodmin, they put on events and host services that give people a reason to come to the high street. Hebden Bridge, there's the town halls in community ownership, and they provide office space which brings working people into the town centre and uses local cafes, pubs and shops. Made in Ashford, they sell craftwork and put on creative activities to the wider community, which draw people into the high street shopping centre. So there's so many great examples, and we need to work out how to increase their number in towns across the country. So just thinking a little bit about what communities, cooperatives and local councils can do. I've touched on it already, but the idea that local authorities need to play a really active role, I think, is key. Things like compulsory purchase orders in certain instances can and should be used, I think. There's a real opportunity to think about how they can use those powers in a kind of strategic way, and then work with the community to put them into community ownership or management. Also, things like meanwhile use. So the idea that spaces that are empty temporarily, how can they be utilised by communities. We've seen lots of examples of cases where it might have been a kind of temporary use in the first instance, but then leads to longer term community use or ownership, which I think is the real ideal, giving people that sustainability and that asset base to build from. Another thing that I think is really important, and I'm sure Evie's faced this challenge, lots of other people we speak to is the kind of access to data and knowing who owns what in a high street. We found some research that someone did for us found that the biggest owners of vacant units are real estate and property companies sitting on these empty properties, 1 in 4, and overseas investors over 1 in 5. And only 1 in 10 vacant units are owned by the public sector or the social sector, which is a kind of real indictment of those other owners that are sitting on them when they could be put to better use in community hands or public ownership. So understanding that mix at a local level can be really difficult for communities. There has been some government progress on this. They're talking about piloting local public registers of ownership based on land registry data. But equally, we need that data now, and we need it to move beyond pilot stage. So as vacancies go up, I think in line with the economic challenges brought about by COVID, having a clear sense of who owns what on the high street is going to be vital for us. For those of us thinking about how we drive social and economic regeneration. And just to hopefully end on a little bit of a hopeful note, I think there's been some hope in there. Thinking about some of the best case and worst case scenarios, I want to talk about a really inspiring example from Plymouth. So Nudge Community Buildings is an inspiring story of a local community that have bit by bit been transforming Union Street in Plymouth. So Union Street is one of those secondary high streets that I was talking about. It's not the main high street in Plymouth, but it's one that in the past, back in the 70s, was a bustling, busy destination for a night out. Since then, it's seen decline, rising property vacancy. Hannah and Wendy, who are co-directors at Nudge, they're people who were brought up in the local area, whose parents went dancing in the clubs of Union Street back in the 70s and had seen it decline. And since then, they've been bringing buildings back into use that the market wouldn't otherwise go near, and breathing new life into the high street. It's been a slow process, a difficult process for some of those reasons that I mentioned, especially the idea that there are these vacant properties. They're not quite sure who owns them. They're owned within a shell that might be offshore somewhere, but they've got a vision for their place. They spoke about the kind of time that they've needed, that it could take up to 5 years for each of the buildings that they're taking on to become sustainable, to be funded by the income they generate through trading. And to get them there, they need grants as part of that mix from various sources, including Power to Change. But they are making real progress. They've got a few buildings now, community market and pop-up cafe called the Clipper, an alternative shopping arcade called the Plot, and that's based on the concept of an allotment. So they're renting out the space patch by patch to local businesses and individuals who want to grow that idea. So you can really see the kind of wider local economic benefits there. It's not just things for Nudge, it's for local entrepreneurs, small businesses and others. We've just put out a podcast on this. You can see it online, and I'm sure we can share it in the chat, but goes into much more detail on the Nudge story. So if you want an English example to go alongside Mid-Steeple Quarter, I'd suggest checking it out. And then, yeah, just a couple of things from a policy perspective that I think would make a real difference. So I think we need to campaign on data transparency. I think that's a really important kind of aspect of this. One of the other things that we've been calling for recently is a community buyout fund. So through that, we're saying that to really tackle the challenges facing the high streets in the years ahead, government needs to introduce a community buyout fund, which would support communities that are ready to take ownership of strategically important high street assets, I think there's lots we can learn, again, from Scotland and the Scottish Land Fund, which Mid-Steeple Cooperative used for their project. And crucially, to kind of get back to that point around the time it takes to make these things sustainable, this fund should not only kind of provide the capital for building purchase, but also include money for feasibility funding and revenue funding to support the early costs of running buildings on the high streets. And in recent weeks, we've been arguing that this should be funded from returned business rate relief. So that was supermarkets had that relief during COVID, as did all businesses, but obviously they've turned huge profits and have returned some of that, well, all of that to Treasury, certain supermarkets, not all of them, I may add. And yeah, there's roughly 2 billion there, and we're arguing that a portion of that should be devoted to a community buyout fund. Then we're also, something we're calling for is community improvement districts. So this is the idea that we need some sort of kind of governance at that hyperlocal level to ensure that communities have a say in the way that their high streets and town centres are run. Of course, hyperlocal governance exists in some places. There are town and parish councils, though more of these are in rural areas. Neighbourhood forums were introduced through the Localism Act. But I think we need a model of governance which is suitable for urban settings and that kind of town centre, high street redevelopment space. So yeah, we're developing some policy around community improvement districts and looking at how they might work. Again, they are a little bit further on in Scotland again, but building on the idea of a business improvement district that involves local businesses, but then how do you bring communities into that mix? So yeah, that's something that we're keen to see develop further. And yeah, I think there's lots of tools that we have. It's just about trying to harness as many of them as we can in the local place, because yeah, as I've said, we need to move these inspiring examples from the margins to the mainstream.
Brilliant, thank you so much, and half doing my job for me with all of these great examples and policy ideas that you're working on. So I'm going to be certainly picking your brains, both of you. We've had lots of comments and questions, and people really inspired, Evie, especially in the chat. So thank you for that, everyone who's watching and taking part. There were a couple of, well, one person wants to know how we can make Dumfries more of a tourist destination, and suggest some improved rail links. But I think there is an important point around how we improve transport and public transport into our town centres. Sandy says, it sticks in the craw that property owners who helped kill the high street can put the price of the properties up when someone tries to regenerate the area. And I think this touches on a really interesting piece. How do we make this a sustainable shift towards community ownership if as soon as the community get involved, it makes it more attractive for all those private businesses that have been sitting on their hands for the past decade. But before I do, I just wanted to echo Nick's shout out for the Nudge community builders in Plymouth. We actually, back in the days when we were allowed to travel to places in real life, launched our 2019 manifesto in the Clipper, ably supported by the team at the Nudge. So a place very close to our hearts, as it's, I think, one of the last times I got out of London for the last year and a half. So that's sort of an extra special spot there. But I don't know if Evie and Nick, you wanted to just touch on what some of those, you know, what can we do about the fact that the better you do at this job, the harder it gets to do this job because place becomes more expensive and in demand? Or is that a good thing? And actually the purpose of community ownership is in part to stimulate sort of that wider reinvigoration. I think, yeah, you know, is it about creating a town that M&S wants to come back to? Or is it about community ownership being the endpoint? If I frame that right. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, I can jump in. I guess I'm not sure I have an answer to that specific question about M&S or community ownership as the endpoint. I think the more community ownership, the better. But I do think that that challenge around the economic hit that communities could face as a result of them regenerating their local areas a really live one. And I think this is an interesting policy question, is how do you ensure that kind of land value uplift, which you see across town centres that have been regenerated from the bottom up, how do you ensure that communities capture that land value uplift and not the people that might own properties that have been sat vacant for years and they haven't done anything and they've just kind of benefited off the community activity? So yeah, I'd be really keen to pick that up, because I think that there are mechanisms through kind of tax systems to capture some of that land value uplift, but ensuring that local authority and communities could benefit from it, not only the people that own the property, I think is key, because then it also incentivizes communities to do more of that stuff if they know that it's going to generate them some income to reinvest in their local place. So yeah, it's a really tricky one, but I think there needs to be a solution to it that favours the community rather than people that have neglected a town for a while.
Evie, if and when you're in charge of the world, what would you, presumably, you know, community ownership's at the heart of what you're doing. You're not simply trying to get things up to a standard where the old model can come back in and you're stuck at the whim of whether those retailers want to stay open or not. What would you do to make sure that that's a sustainable process and that it, you know, would help to keep it affordable for communities to do this?
I guess there's two things for me. The first one is legislation is a little bit further on in Scotland. So, I mean, we could, I mean, it's difficult for us, the size of the organisation we are. We need to set up another organisation to be able to fulfil this. But it's a bureaucratic nightmare. But if we can put a sort of intention of a community right to buy on buildings, so I mean that is an option for us, but right now part of that is around distributing a ballot, getting a proportion of people in favour of it, and right now the way that our membership's structured, that's about 40,000 people we would have to ask, which just for a community group is just, you know, not feasible. So for us, there's part around, well, how do we make that easier? Because actually you've had your chance, private sector, you've had your chance, people that, you know, want to own these buildings, that's fine, keep it on your asset sheet, keep it on your balance, fine. But actually enough's enough, time's up, and we need to, you know, look at a different solution here. If, however, you know, that's not something that is going to work for us, part of what it has to be, I think, is about energy and something being there. So if you are going to come, if you are going to open something up, if you are going to, you know, work with us, the people who live there, and, you know, we'll use these places, you know, and we'll love them and care for them and do all the things that people in areas do, then that's okay. You know, we're never going to say no to that. But I think for communities to be able to do this affordably, there needs to be another option. And, you know, I'm just thinking after what you were talking about, Nick, about how, you know, I think the other thing that we can't afford to be is selfish. So if somebody's getting progress, this is about everybody, not just individual projects, and, you know, using the collective ear. And I love what you said about, you know, taking things from the margins to the mainstream. Like, this is everybody in this together. And if the community-owned high street is how this ends up, then wonderful, but it has to be everybody, not just us.
No, I think that's quite right. There's been a couple of comments around, you know, where we're at the mercy of private owners. It's hard to find out who those owners are. Whether there should be a greater role for compulsory purchase, not sort of an arbitrary one, but, you know, if there are sort of conditions put on spaces that aren't being used, whether there's scope for a compulsory purchase. I don't know if you've got any views on compulsory purchase as a good or a bad thing. Presumably it requires you to have that shared vision with your local authority or whoever's got those compulsory purchase powers.
Do you want to go, Evie?
No, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's compulsory purchase is quite a kind of confrontational thing, and it's often a last resort. But as Evie said, that in many cases time is up, and places that have been left vacant for a long time, I think it's a perfectly legitimate tool. But yeah, I guess with all of these things, that's a kind of local authority exercising their right, but it should only be done if there's been a genuine dialogue with the community about how it might be used, and a clear understanding of if this is something that we're going to take ownership of, then how the community going to have a sustainable model to take it on. So we've seen with things like community asset transfer in councils that often there's a kind of a bit of a burden placed on communities. So this is an asset that we can't look after anymore. It's not particularly viable. So it's time for the community to take it on and sink or swim type thing, which is really not the way to be doing community asset transfer. It should be about partnership and shared vision for a place. And I'd say the same about a CPO. If you're going to do that with the community in mind, make sure there's been some serious planning, funding, etc. in place before that happens, so that the community is able to take it on sustainably.
It's a good point that sort of cooperatives and community ownership shouldn't be seen as a last resort in times of crisis, but actually we need to be running the viable good stuff so that we can maximize the value and benefit of those good things for our communities and members. Evie, did you want to hop in on this point?
I think, I've not got a huge amount to add to what has already articulated way better than I could, but I think it's just about being in front of it, and whether that's, getting to a point that a CPO is the absolute last result, or and I think the other thing about, community asset transfers ending up leaving communities with burdens, it's about what's next. And the people, it's as much about the people being part of it, but actually keeping a fresh stream of ideas and different people involved with it, because things are going to change. What's going to work today might not be what works in 5 years' time. And actually now more than ever, what's going to work today and what might work in 6 months' time could be completely different. So I think it's about, being a little bit entrepreneurial about it as well, not just like, right, we want this back because nobody's in there. Actually, what are you going to do with it? And be a bit ahead of it.
No, I think that's a really good point. And I'm aware that I promised you I'd let you go by 11:30, but I've got a couple of really interesting things. I'm just going to bring them up and then maybe tie in any response with sort of a closing remarks if you've got any. One is around, and we sort of touched very briefly on sort of taxation structures, but with the shift to online shopping and organisations like Amazon not having to pay business rates, but that business rates on high streets can be really onerous for the shops that want to operate there. How we might go about reforming that, so that, or whether you think it needs reform in order to make high streets more competitive. And I think that's a really interesting one. And then just a comment / question from Jane Cameron, who I know is very involved in the housing cooperative movement, a former member of staff, talking about, well, what options are there for sort of cooperative models in the spaces above shops? So as well as that community ownership for the shop floor, what can we do around housing cooperative and community ownership for housing upstairs, which I think is really important. And then finally, around how we use the space, a few comments on sort of with the shift to working from home, those sort of publicly community owned workspaces in high streets and towns, and whether that's what we're going to see the future high street look like, is going to be more workspace, more places to get your lunch and fewer places to buy socks. So don't feel obliged to answer all of those, but I thought if I put a good mix, you can pick up any of that you think is particularly relevant to your experiences. Should we do Nick then Evie? Does that sound okay?
Cool. I wanted to pick up on the bit about community owned workspace. I think reform to business rates, clearly there's lots of people calling for that, and I think that's something that needs to happen. I don't have enough expertise on what would replace it, but I'm keen to hear views on that, because yeah, we're always looking for ideas about how those spaces can be made easier for communities. And similarly on housing, I think housing is going to be a part of the mix in high streets in the future. I think that there's some interesting stuff coming out from government with their announcements on the right to regenerate recently, which on the face of it could be a good thing for communities, and especially community-led housing groups. Equally, it could be a route to kind of private developers getting their hands on space through the back door with communities as cover, which is a real risk. But I think that's an interesting kind of space to watch, especially for kind of small scale community-led housing projects. But yeah, I think that community and workspace thing is really exciting. And certainly when I was sat at home, as I have been for the last 9 or 10 months, I was thinking the idea of community-owned workspace, not just on the high street, but in neighbourhoods everywhere, is something that probably is going to be more important as businesses close their offices. It's no longer financially viable for them to have big offices in the centre of cities. That there's a real opportunity for community-owned workspace, both on the high street and in neighbourhoods. And I think it's something that we in the kind of community sector need to get out ahead of and think about where that space is and how we can really kind of put a claim on it.
And I think just to sort of loop in another favourite topic of mine is how we could create perhaps community-owned workspaces which also have on-site community-owned childcare, so that we're able to create that balance of home working and caring, and especially for sort of women as well and single parents, being able to get back into the workplace without being hamstrung by sort of privatized expensive nursery fees. But anyway, that is a whole separate bugbear of mine, and I will stop abusing my position as chair and hand over to Evie to close up for us.
The rates issue, I think, you know, something has to change here again. You know, people are going to be starting new things in the face of a recession, and I think, you know, new business, new creatives, new ideas, whatever it might be, it needs to be given a chance. And actually, if we stand any hope of changing the face of the high street, people need to be able to try things out. On the housing piece, for us, the housing that we're going to deliver in Dumfries will be the first large-scale affordable housing provision in the town centre for a generation. That in itself is hugely important, but also for me personally, for older people, you know, these are flats, but actually for older people, you know, when their homes that they've been in for all their lives potentially become unsuitable for them, you know, the options are really limited. But actually to give them that, you know, make your life your own, and continue to keep with a house that's actually fit for your needs for as long as you can be at home independently is really, really important. We're also exploring co-housing models for the town centre, and actually, you know, just having community-owned housing and community-led housing in the town centre will be, you know, the first of its kind here. But, you know, inevitably this will all be managed by the people of the town. So whatever the housing model does end up looking like, at the heart of it will be the people that it serves. And then finally, I think the workspace thing has to be a part of it. People want to get back together more than anything else. And if you haven't got an office to go to, that is a place that, you know, you can get that connection, but also put something back into that place that you are anyway. And I think in terms for us on that sustainability agenda, for a bit of income generation, you know, to think about what's next, to get back in front of whatever you are going to do. And, you know, that may well be opening up the community-owned childcare. Anna, it might be, you know, but we need some means of doing that. So I think as long as there's attractive options that are set at a rate that, you know, people want to use and feel as if they're contributing and they're part of something, I think that's it has to be the way forward.
Absolutely, and I love how you brought together our previous session on social care and also looking at the needs of older people in high streets, because that is a perfect way to show that cooperation can be a golden thread through everything that we do to quote others. And we actually had questions on how we can create high streets and housing that is lifelong rather than just fitting different age groups. So thank you for unconsciously answering that question for us. Tumbling over my words now. Well, I'm going to close this session with a massive thank you to Nick and Evie. I'm sure that everyone watching is applauding quietly in their own homes, so you'll have to imagine the standing ovation from your kitchen tables. But a really interesting start to our policy development in this area, and I think highlighting how important it is, particularly in the current climate, but equally the rich set of ideas and aspirations that are existing in communities already that we can draw from and take inspiration from. So thank you. And when COVID's over, we'll all have to come up to Dumfries for a visit, Evie, if we can get those trains sorted as per the comment in the chat. But thank you so much. For everybody watching, our next session is where you split out, not from this streamed one, but into separate Zooms. So London has a Zoom call, the Southeast has a Zoom call, and East has a Zoom call where you're able to get involved in some more local campaigning, hear from your candidates and councillors, and think about how we can build parties in your region. It should be easy to join, but if you're struggling at all, events@party.coop is your place to go for any help from my colleagues. So looking to my colleagues to take the screen away from our faces and give you the information about the next slide and call this section to an end. Thank you.